Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our very special webinar on growing complexities of China-India relations. Before I start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envisage a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. China Studies is one of our major research centers, so is our neighborhood studies. But China Studies as a whole brings into perspective the rising powers mounting economic, military, and diplomatic cloud that certainly has the aptitude to either sustain or sustain the current contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategic thinking and conduct, foreign and security policies, and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. We have been holding regular interactions on China with experts from around the world. We have three panels to speak on the topic of today: Professor Patrick Mendes, former US diplomat, Professor Soren Singh from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Dr. Antonina Luciskiewicz. To chair and moderate today's session, we have Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt. Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt is elected member of House of Representatives at the Federal Parliament of Nepal. He is a member of International Affairs Committee of the Federal Parliament of Nepal. He holds PhD from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Previously, he has served as a member of High-Level Task Force on reorienting Nepal's foreign policy, headed by Minister of Foreign Affairs and the member of Technical Committee and Secretariat formed for Supervision, Integration, and Rehabilitation of Maoist Army Combatant. He is a visiting fellow at Tribhuvan University, Nepal Army Higher Command and Management Course, Army Command and Staff College, Institute of Crisis Management Studies, and Armed Police Force Command and Staff College of Nepal. He has also participated at the DKI, Asia Pacific Center for Strategic Studies, Hawaii, Center for Study of United States Institutes on Foreign Policy, his Ministry Government Security and Justice course at University of Birmingham, an advanced level course on disarmament, demobilization, and reorientation. Courses of Translation International, the Netherlands. He has also co-edited a book, Rebalancing Asia, Belt and Road Initiative and Indo-Pacific Strategy, published by Springer. Now I'd like to hand over the floor to Dr. Bhatt. Dr. Bhatt, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod, and thank you, Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, and the team, the NICE team. It's nice to be here, to be sharing a session with Professor Soren Singh, Professor Patrick Mendes, and Dr. Antonia. I think, and in a recent time, Dr. Pramod and the NICE team has been organizing a very pertinent seminars and webinars on the very pertinent issues. And in the recent time, NICE has become a very established think tank in Kathmandu, and in IR arena, it's been very established organization. So no need to say something or anything more about the organization here. And today, as we are talking about the complexity and especially the two global power, two different civilizations, two different political systems, and rivalry between them, and the complexity in recent time. Especially, we have seen since 2007, they have been conducting joint military exercises till 2019. So 7 or 8 joint military exercises, and the relations between the Modi first government and the Xi Jinping's first tenure. So China is holding its 20th National Conference, and on the other side, India is engaging in many international or the regional or the sub-regional multidimensional organizations, from Indo-Pacific strategies to the Quad, and then of course we can see them together in the BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and many more. So without, and even in the AIIB, but there are many areas where it seems that not only the last year's trade between India and China and Indian supply chain systems and many things have been discussed in many recent articles and the books, but the focus here is like the complexity in terms of some the military conflicts in the recent past, and then from Doklam to Galwan, and in recent the last year we have seen that the trade between these two countries has gone very high. And so how these complexities are will be seen in the near future. So here the panel is ready to make the presentations. First of all, I will introduce Dr. Professor Patrick Mendes. He's a former American diplomat and a military professor in the NATO and the Indo-Pacific commands of the US Department of Defense. He's a distinguished visiting professor of transatlantic relations at the University of Warsaw, Poland, as well as a distinguished visiting professor of global affairs in the National Chengchi University in Taiwan, a non-resident senior fellow of Synergia Foundation in India and the Taiwan Center for Security Studies in Taipei. Professor Mendes served as a distinguished visiting professor of Sino-American relations at the Yangqing Academy of Peking University in Beijing. He is a former US National Commissioner to the UNESCO and the Secretariat Director of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, as well as the chairman of the Interagency Policy Working Group on Science and Technology at the US Department of State during the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administration. So with this, I will hand over chance to Professor Patrick Mendes.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatt, your kind introduction. And just to make sure that, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, sir, we can.
We can see. Please go ahead. Sound, you are audible. We can see your PowerPoints. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much again for kind introduction. And again, I wanted to also thank you, my dear friend Swaran and Dr. Antonina from Poland to join us over here. Again, thank you very much for inviting all of us for this important conversation. I wanted to focus on growing complexity at one aspect of it, and it is to the will the Indian Ocean become a China's Western Ocean? It is largely arriving from my recent article in the Harvard International Review. And here I'm talking about how the China's involvement in the Indian Ocean evolved and a kind of potential issues that we can see in the coming years. So with that background, I just want to look at it, China's overall grand strategy for the Indo-Pacific region. Here, when President Xi Jinping initiated the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, they have two routes in the northern routes that go in on the Northern Silk Road. And the southern one is Southern Maritime Silk Road that goes through the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean and to all the way to the Europe. So here, this southern strategy, which I try to focus on, while the northern strategy and Dr. Antonina is going to focus on. Here, US and also the China in this matter has two unsinkable aircraft carriers, one in their strategy. One is in Taiwan. It came when General Douglas MacArthur introduced this term, unsinkable aircraft carrier, representing Taiwan. And now there are a number of tensions going on both in the air and naval and also political, economic, and diplomatic aspect between China and Taiwan. So that aspect, while going on, China has another strategy in the Indian Ocean, which is focused largely on Sri Lanka. Here, Sri Lanka is a part of that Belt and Road Initiative, is become more or less most important strategic point for China's overall grand strategy. Then when you look at it, that grand strategy is also pretty much important to the United States. US also send a very clear message to the Taiwan and also to the China in the South China, in the Indian Ocean. One is when the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and it created a lot of tension between China and the US, and also China exercised numerous military exercise around the Republic of China, which is Taiwan. And then at the same time, there is another incident happened in August, that Yuan Wang 5 arrived into the Indian Ocean and docked at the Hambantota port, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit later. And then September, US AID Administrator Samantha Power visited Sri Lanka, and she said in the middle of that Sri Lankan debt crisis that it is important for China to cooperate in this process openly and in comparable terms with others. Others mean in Japan, India, and Asian Development Bank, and IMF. So in that broader program, broader perspective, you can see there is both historical perspective, there is two unsinkable aircraft carriers in the Pacific and also the Indian Ocean. So when you look at that one, this broader perspective that in the past, I have been working with these issues. Here, Dr. Antonina and I have written several number of articles on India, Sri Lanka, and Taiwan, and also the US-China relation. And also my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Swaran Singh, and I work on it, and we have a long friendship going back to the Chinese when we were in China together. So given this background, first, Dr. Antonina is going to talk about earlier Northern strategy, which is talking about what Dr. Chairman at that time, Mao Zedong, in 1939 said about Tibet. Tibet is the right-hand palm of China, and with the 5 fingers on the periphery, which is they are referring to the now currently talking about the border issues, and which will be discussed in detail by Dr. Antonina. And then I am going to focus on President Xi Jinping's what he called Sri Lanka as a splendid jewel in the BRI project of China's national rejuvenation. Given this one, and Dr. Singh will focus on overall issues and fill in the gaps that we might have missed, and then make a different kind of analysis and commentary on India, China, and US relation, both in the Indian context and also in other perspective from the regional actors. So given back to that one, and if you can see that China's BR project started with in East China Sea. And when they had started that conflict with Japan over the Senkaku Island, or the Chinese call it Jawa Island, East China Sea. And then it moved into South China Sea and building artificial island and making them military bases, that which direct conflict with their Southeast Asian neighbors of the South China Sea region, with especially with Vietnam, the Philippines, and also other stakeholders around the Spratly and Paracel Island. So then the third phase, President Xi Jinping always mentioned about we have a long march coming in gradually, and also one phase, second phase, and third phase. I think this is what they are decoding, coding is third phase is the Western Ocean. Western Ocean is referred to Indian Ocean. It was a battle for Indian Ocean islands, where that 600 years ago, Admiral Chung He took his treasure ship to the Indian Ocean. At that time, Ming Ennoy, Admiral Chung He, went to Asia 7 times and 3 times to Sri Lanka. And in Sri Lanka, he established a gold trilingual tablet in the port city of Galle, which essentially promoting international trade even at that time, 600 plus years ago. And 611 years ago, they had a conflict with the Sri Lankan ruler at that time, Veera Alakeshwara. And then this conflict, they have captured the king and his family and also the notable people around him and took them to Nanjing, the Ming emperor's court, at that time the capital of China, Nanjing. So from there, a year later, they were released, of course, and that time when the King Alakeshwara came in Sri Lanka, the Parakambahu III was in ruling the country, and they would not able to put the Chinese installed representative in Sri Lanka as a tributary state 600 plus years ago. So given that one, fast forward, China now exercising that rejuvenation, the bringing back the Chinese revival, Chinese culture and the nation. Forefront of this is struggle right now, and the tension and the competition going on between the China and India, as well as the US and other world powers. So, excuse me. So when Yuan Wanfai, which is dubbed as a Indian media as a spy ship, came into Hambantota port, which was owned by the Chinese for next 99 years leased on that land and the port. So at that time, in August, China refused to listen to the Indian and also the US request not to go into Sri Lanka. And as these 2 countries, India and US, asked the Sri Lankan government not to allow this ship to berth in Sri Lankan ports. Initially, they took pretty quiet, pretty much. And then later on, they let this ship to come into the Hambantota port for 1 week. This is the most sophisticated symbol of maritime superiority that is shown right now, how much that superiority and technological advancement are shown in this ship. And this is again the revival of the symbol of that Ming dynasty is coming into that Indian Ocean or the Western Ocean, China called it. Even in the Chinese literature and poetry, a Western Ocean is a very celebrated term they have been using. Even having said that one, that Sri Lanka allowed this ship to come in, it is pretty much violated the memorandum of understanding between India and Sri Lanka has had, and it was called the Indian Ocean Maritime Domain Awareness, which means every time the foreign ships coming into Sri Lanka, they have to notify the Indian government and get the approval. So that was kind of pretty much violated, and it is a kind of diplomatic and military slap on the northern India, northern neighbor of Sri Lanka. So given that one, this is all happening in the middle of debt crisis and Aragalaya, that is the people uprising in Colombo. And here, Sri Lanka owes $56 billion to other lenders. Having said that, China is focused as the greatest lender. In fact, China is not the highest lender to Sri Lanka, the creditor to Sri Lanka, but it is pretty much Asian Development Bank, and then Japan, and then China. But China's 10% of this national debt of Sri Lanka is pretty much understatement. Some estimate, they say, more than 20% of national debt is owed to China. This part is becoming very revealing because many of these loans and credit lines support in the Sri Lankan projects are not necessarily transparent. So therefore, that is why Samantha Powers, US AID administrator, came to Sri Lanka, and she said that we need to have China open up and tell us what is actually going on in these loans in order to have resolved and come up with a plan to resolve this debt crisis right now. So given that background, and President Ranil Wickremesinghe of Sri Lanka went to Japan a few days ago and met with the Japanese counterpart. And he also mentioned about India in the Sri Lankan parliament, very congratulatory manner to the Indian support for Sri Lanka during the early part of this year. And then President Xi Jinping and also the Sri Lankan counterpart also spoke to each other, trying to resolve this issue of a debt crisis, which is an enormous amount that Sri Lanka cannot afford to do. So given this, and Sri Lanka's issues are pretty much of the center of the Indian Ocean or the Western Ocean. So Sri Lanka is very critical to Chinese strategy, because it pretty much encircles that all the pipeline and the gas pipeline going through the Pakistan on the west side of India, and also in the east side of the Burmese Chinese corridor that connect the Indian Ocean to Kunming. And the western Pakistani Chinese border, Chinese corridor is connected to the western part of Xinjiang province and Tibet region of China. So given this one, you can see this is a connection and encircling pretty much India, both economic sense. And this goes back to this is economic prosperity is also connected to the Ming dynasties in the 600 plus years ago. So given this one, there's another issue coming out of this one is that Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora is having their own government outside Sri Lanka, and they are putting the pressure on the Indian national government and also the Western government, trying to get human rights issues resolved, which after their Tamil civil war in Sri Lanka, that which killed many people in both sides. So therefore, they are wanted to have an independent Tamil state called Elam in the north and the east and western part of Sri Lanka, which is the 2/3 of the Sri Lanka's coastal region. Give the Trincomalee, the strategic harbor, to the India and also the US to access that natural harbor, one of the 3 natural harbors in the world. So therefore, that has this nationalism has a danger for China, India, pretty much because India does not want to have a Tamil Nadu separated from the rest of the India and connected with their kingship with the Sri Lankan Northern Tamil population. So that also play out with the Sri Lankan government, which is largely a Buddhist nationalistic government, and how this is human rights issues playing out in the United Nations these days. And you can see this can become this Elam nationalism, create a problem for Sri Lanka and also for India, and as well as China. And China recognized this important issue, which I'm going to highlight a little bit later, why this Tamil nationalism is going to undermine the Chinese interest in Sri Lanka. Therefore, it is also going to have troublesome for China as well, this issue. And the third one is the US Millennium Challenge Corporation wanted to give grants. They are not loans, they are grants to connect the Colombo and Trincomalee, the strategic 2 ports, through this what they call it Colombo Trincomalee Economic Corridor between Colombo and northeastern province of Sri Lanka toward connecting to Trincomalee. So this one also augment that existing SOFA agreement and AXA agreement between the US and Sri Lanka.
Sorry to interrupt you, Professor Mendes. You have to try to wrap up in 2 to 3 minutes.
Sure. All right. Thank you. So therefore, there is this is augment process going on in the military aspect as well. So you can see that last few years, last 20 plus years or so, US and India has a strong partnership in the military aspect. There are 4 agreements are signed between the 2 countries. This is the US strategy supporting the Chinese to compete with the China in the Indian Ocean. India is a major key regional partner to doing the US strategy, carry out the US strategy. This invisible hand can be seen recently when the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman said, we wanted to have this debt crisis is solved more independent central bank, and also showing the what China is doing in these loans and provide the transparency to the entire process. You can see that behind this is the IMF debt crisis, and there is the United States is very clearly involved in it because of their national interest. And they created also new pathways for China, India, and because during the early part of this year, India provided a $4 billion support to deal with the debt crisis, and therefore now Sri Lankan government, President Wickremesinghe said they wanted to restart all the projects that were underway but stopped on the previous administration. He want to revive all these projects. And then this is China is the new pathway is opening up. Chinese ambassador to Sri Lanka went to Jaffna and met with Hindu Tamil religious group, and you can see this Ambassador Chi went with their Hindu dressed into this Kovil, demonstrating that they are also concerned about it. And this also reflect the Admiral Chung He's that trilingual tablet establishing a goal. At that time, it was written in Tamil and Persian and also in Chinese, not in Sinhalese. You can see now China really understand its own culture and history and the Ming dynasty's influence on Sri Lanka. So therefore, you can see now China is also engaging in this issue in the Sri Lanka's northern Elam region that Elam diaspora is trying to advocate. So given this one, Sri Lanka is between the rock and hard place. But this is also conflicting challenges for complex challenges for India and Sri Lanka and China. And this is what I call the China, India, and America's challenge is the CIA challenge. If US were to do that one, it has to be carefully calibrated what their objectives are. And it is true for China and India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Patrick Mendes, for your in-depth and insightful presentation. In fact, you have pointed many dimensions of the complexity in the Indian Ocean, especially, and when it you relate it with the Sri Lankan context and how CIA term as you used about the present context. And yes, and on the other hand, we have seen in August Yuan Wang 5, the submarine was at Hambantota port, and in recent speech by Chinese President Xi Jinping said that he or the China has been trying to avoid the two-sided trap, and at the same time, some scholars have been pointing there could be kind of trap or how to avoid all these kind of traps. But these are some theoretical aspects. But now, as we have reached to the second presentation, and we'll have about 30 minutes discussion after following the 3 presentations. So now I would like to invite Dr. Annotin for her presentation. Dr. Antonina Luzasnikiewicz, if sorry if I could not pronounce properly, is an expert on the political and cultural histories of China, India, and the India-China relations. Exactly, she has been dealing with the issue and the area. She is the founding head of the Taiwan Lab Research Center and the assistant professor at the Institute of Middle and the Far East at Jagiellonian University, Krakow, Poland, while also serving as a non-resident fellow at the Taiwan Center University, Republic of China, ROC. She has MA in the Far Eastern Studies from the Faculty of International and Political Studies and a PhD, Doctor of Humanities in the field of Cultural Studies from Jagiellonian University in Poland. She has published a number of books, contributed to book chapters and journal articles, and actively take part in the conferences and workshops focusing on the India-China-US relations and Asian affairs. She has collaborated with other experts in academic journals, including the Harvard International Review, Review of the International Affairs, the National Interest, South China Morning Post, and the Diplomat. And she is fluent in English, Chinese, and Hindi, of the very top context, having fluency in these 3 languages. And so, Dr. Nunina, could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I can see you. You're audible. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bhatt, for your kind introduction.
So I will allow you in 10 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen if you allow me to. So I hope you won't have any technical issues here. Please let me know if you can see my presentation.
Yeah, we can see. Please go ahead.
Wonderful. So thank you again for your kind introduction. And I would really like to thank for inviting me and for reaching out to me to organize this amazing event. And it is a great pleasure for me to speak about China-India relations among such distinguished guests today. I'm actually joining you not from Poland today, but from the United States, because I'm currently a Fulbright Senior Scholar at Indiana University in Bloomington. And as Dr. Bhatt has already mentioned, I'm also a founding director of the Taiwan Lab Research Center at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, which is the oldest 14th century university in Poland. So as Professor Mendes has already mentioned, I'm going to focus on the Northern Belt or the issues from the north for India, which I call, for the purpose of this presentation, the Northern Triad. So what do I mean by Northern Triad? These are the border issue, which is probably the most obvious issue that we can think of when it comes to China-India relations. But today I would also like to touch upon maybe the less widely discussed issues, such as the water issue, which is related to the fact that India is a lower riparian state. So it's all related to the fact that India and China are sharing some water resources. And in the end, I will also talk about the political and ideological dimension of the Tibetan issue, because Tibetan issue was not wrapped up once and for all in 1950, neither was it closed in 1959 as a result of the failed uprising. It is actually an ongoing dynamic matter. Actually, over the next few years, it might become an even bigger challenge in China-India relations. Let me start with the border dispute. We don't have time, unfortunately, to go into details, but it is important to remember that the border issue is something much more than just a dispute over a line on a map. In fact, it's an issue which is related to the historical legacy, and this historical legacy is also a basis for national identity for both India and China, as a matter of fact. It's also an issue of international prestige and definitely an issue related to a generally speaking rivalry between China and India over influences in South Asia. I would like to spend a little bit more time today on the water issue. Actually, over the last 2-3 years, and particularly after the Galvan River crisis, some think tanks and some research institutions started to take a deeper look into China-India relations in the context of the water issue. Nevertheless, it is still not that widely known topic or problem or challenge. If we look at the map, we will see that China has a huge advantage over India and other South Asian and Southeast Asian countries, as a matter of fact, because it controls Tibetan Plateau, and Tibetan Plateau is the source of the most important rivers of East, South, and Southeast Asia, as we can clearly see. So why is it so problematic when it comes to China-India relations? Over the last few decades, China has been developing a huge network of river dams, which serve as power plants in the first place, but they can also make it possible for China to store or divert water in a way that it might impact on vast territories down the stream, including territories which are already located in another country down the stream, like in the case of India or in case of the countries of Southeast Asia. I'm deliberately using this vague term impact because a drought can be as devastating as a flood. So you can store or divert water, leading to drying up vast territories down the stream. But you may also, release lots of water in a pretty sudden way, leading to a flood. And we had such cases in 2021 when it comes to the Mekong River. Chinese activities on river dams lead to the fact that the water level on Mekong River dropped by 1 meter. You might think, well, Mekong is such a huge river, so does 1 meter really make any change, Unfortunately, yes, it does. 1 meter is a lot when it comes to fishing activities, when it comes to transportation, when it comes to farming. So these kind of changes, especially if they are sudden, and if the countries are not, or the governments of those countries are not warned in advance, as it happened in that case in early 2021, this can have terrible consequences for all the livelihood down the stream. So it hasn't really happened yet when it comes to China-India relations. We did see in 2017 a case of the Brahmaputra River where when China did not share crucial hydrological data with India about the upcoming flood. Many experts claim that it was some sort of a revenge after the Doklam standoff crisis. However, we can easily imagine that this might become a real, if not the most important issue in the future in China-India relations. And finally, it is worth taking a look into the Tibetan issue. We all probably wish Dalai Lama a long life. However, we have to face the truth that he's already an older gentleman and nobody is immortal unless you possess a philosopher's stone or any other magical elixir. But seriously, we have to face the possibility that in 1 year, 5 years, maybe 10 years, Dalai Lama will pass away, and then his successor will have to be found. It's more than certain that China will try to promote their own candidate for the reincarnation of the current Dalai Lama, whereas the current Dalai Lama has been changing his narrative a couple of times. First, he was saying that perhaps the deity in him, to be more precise, this is a whole religious thing, the deity in him will not be reincarnated at all. But recently, he has been suggesting that perhaps he will reincarnate not in Tibet, but actually in India, among Tibetan diaspora located in northern India, for example. So we can see that this might become a huge political and ideological challenge in China-India relations. So what are the strategies of India, or what kind of strategies can India apply in regard to all these three challenges? So when it comes to the border issue, the big question is, should India try to maintain the status quo at all costs, or should India actively resist? The 2020 Galvan River deadly skirmish shows us that India is getting prepared for more and more plucky, brave, standing up to China challenge. And interestingly, India itself went against the 1988 consensus, according to which the China-India border dispute was to be separated from all other aspects of China-India relations, meaning that China and India were, opening up economic development, economic exchange, social relations, cultural relations, and so on and so forth. However, in 2020, India decided to ban almost 60 Chinese apps. India was supposed to become the biggest foreign market for those apps, such as TikTok or WeChat. So this was a huge, loss and hit for those Chinese applications. Actually, afterwards, the number of banned apps in India went up and crossed 250 as far as I'm concerned. So right now there are more than 250 Chinese apps which are totally banned in India as a result and as a sort of retaliation or punishment for the Galvan Valley crisis. So we can see that India is not only ready or getting prepared to respond in military terms, because we also have to remember about the deployment of hundreds of thousands of Chinese and Indian soldiers along the line of actual control. Quite recently, both countries decided to disengage in the so-called Western sector. Nevertheless, the border issue is still there. It doesn't solve the issue itself. So we can see that India is become more and more actively resistant in this matter. What about the water issue? Here, the case is a little bit more complicated, because the question is, how can you impact on the country up the stream, which is controlling the sources of rivers and can pretty much, on its own independently build as many river dams as it wants to and pretty much manipulate with the water level. Of course, you need trans-border agreements, you need trans-border international frameworks based on friendship and cooperation and goodwill, which is really, really difficult to achieve. It is also important to remember that India is not the only country with such a China problem. I've already mentioned the countries of Southeast Asia, so perhaps we could look for some sort of transnational solidarity and some sort of frameworks which would put more pressure on China not to apply the kind of unfair tools and taking advantage over countries down the stream. Nevertheless, it's also worth remembering that India is no saint here, because India itself is accused itself by Pakistan and Bangladesh of breaking agreements, of some unfair activities when it comes to water sharing. For instance, Pakistan has been accusing India of breaking the 1960 Indus River Treaty or Water Treaty. So we can see that India first perhaps should solve problems with its own neighbors before it can actually accuse China more openly of unfair practices. And the third issue, the Tibetan issue, can India actually play the Tibetan card against China? I would say that among all these three issues, this is a sphere where India has the biggest place for maneuvering, and India actually has the upper hand in the sense that it can decide to what extent and if, in the first place, whether it really wants to play the Tibetan card against China. So what would that mean, playing the Tibetan card against China? It would mean, of course, promoting a very negative image of China as a country which is violating human rights in Tibet. So this could also lead to some actions, for example, in the United Nations, perhaps some resolutions against China, not to mention, of course, training Tibetan guerrilla fighters, but this is perhaps the most extreme version. I'm not taking into consideration claiming Tibetan independence, because this is probably out of the question. Nevertheless, India does have a wide range of tools it can actually apply when it comes to this Tibetan context. And finally, something perhaps we don't have time to talk about it here, but maybe we'll have more time to elaborate on this question in the Q&A session. There is a very, very interesting angle to the Tibetan matter in the context of Hindutva. So it's a paradox that Dalai Lama and Hindutva, particularly RSS, are kind of on the same side, and they are allies in this matter. Because if you actually look at the map, which shows us the idea of Akhand Bharat, that is the Great India or undivided India, that shows us that Tibet is considered to be a part of that big Hindu family or Hindu civilization. After all, we have to remember that Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, and these are considered to be a part of Hindu mentality and lifestyle and not as separate religions. So this gives the Hindutva followers.
Dr. Antonina, could you please wrap it up?
Thank you. I am just 2 more minutes. Thank you. So that gives the space for Hindutva followers to claim that Tibet is a part of kind of Hindu family or Hindu civilization, and then it also gives more space to, protect Tibetan religious rights and get more engaged into this whole matter. So far, BJP itself has been much more restrained. It was the RSS, so the mother party or the brother party, if you prefer, that has been more open when it comes to Tibetan matter. Nevertheless, who knows, maybe one day BJP will actually take some tools or suggestions from RSS and make this matter more open. So that leads us to a question on whether India can stand up to all these challenges itself. And as Professor Mendes has already been showing, there is the sometimes invisible, sometimes very much visible United States hand in this whole matter. And I just wanted to briefly explain that all these 3 issues that I've been talking about have already been recognized by the government of the United States. The first 2 of them, the border issue and the water issue, have even been labeled as continental challenges by the United States. When it comes to Tibet, we also have a very interesting legislation according to which the United States is ready to put sanctions on every Chinese official which will interfere in the succession of the current Dalai Lama. I've actually been talking about this on one conference at the University of Kansas, and I realized that so many people were like half of the audience, they were taking up their mobile phones and taking pictures because apparently nobody knew about this legislation. So I think it's really worth talking about it and stressing that the US is legally, not just vocally, but legally preparing to take actions against China when Dalai Lama passes away and when all this problem becomes another global issue, not just regional issue. Interestingly, the very same document, the very same legislation talks about the water security issue and calls for international agreements which would solve the problems related to water issues. So again, we can see that not just India itself, but even other countries, including the main player, the United States. Finishing up, thank you. So 2 questions in the end. Are India and China destined for war? That is a very broadly discussed question, but I would actually ask, are India and the United States destined for alliance? So maybe we will touch upon it more in the Q&A session. However, these 2 cases, these 2 questions are tightly or even inseparably related to each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Antonina. You have covered quite serious or should say very fascinating ideas of the river, ecological dimension, and then not just upon the climatic issue, but yes, of course, it is related, and then border, very serious core of the national security, hard one, and then of course the Tibet, and then religious aspects, and then engagement, and the area of how this particular era, as China has gone from the Mao era, Deng era to Xi Jinping era, and India has crossed the Nehruvian era, and then Indira Gandhi era, and then I should say the Aike Gujral era, or the coalition government era, and then now the Modi era. So Modivian India. So how they will deal with the core hardcore security issue, and of course the ecological and the soft issues interesting. And now Professor Swaran Singh, my guru at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's professor and the chairperson of the School of International Studies at JNU. He is in the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, CPOD. Professor Swaran Singh is also serving as the president of the Association of Asia Scholars, General Secretary of the Indian Association of Asian and Pacific Studies, guest professor at the Yunnan University of Finance and Economics, China, and an advisory member of the board member of Communities Without Borders, Inc., and based in Atlanta, USA. Professor Singh is a visiting professor at many universities around the world. Professor Singh has co-edited, co-authored, and published extensively in many academic journals, books focusing on Asian affairs, Chinese foreign and security policy, focusing on China-India confidence building measures, as well as arms control and disarmament, peace and conflict resolution, India's foreign policy and security policy issues. So Professor Swaran Singh don't need much, any kind of this introduction dimensions, but at this point, I will add one thing. Professor, could you put some light to how ASEAN outlook on Indian Pacific kind of mechanisms or the networks and Indo-Pacific Oceans initiative in the Indian Ocean, and of course the Sagar, we can say, the security and growth for all in the region. Sagar 2015, it was like heavily orchestrated by Modi government as its foreign policy component. We have seen from activist policy and BIMSTEC or all these kind of some measures or the architectures or the infrastructures or something have been tried, but how these issues with complexity with India-China relations is there. Now, please over to Professor Swaran Singh. Please,
thank you. Thank you, Professor Deepak Bhatt. My thanks also to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and to the rest of the team of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. I'm delighted to be on the panel with Patrick, an old friend of mine. And of course, I had heard the name of Antonina before, but I'm happy that we are on the same panel today. And let me begin by first dealing with two questions that Antonina stopped her presentation with. Whether India and China are likely to go to war and whether India and United States are going to have an alliance. I think that's a very pertinent set of two questions, which makes me begin by complimenting the organizers to call the title of today's panel discussion Growing Complexities. Now, obviously, these do not imply growing difficulties. It's about growing complexities of India-China relations. Complexities basically mean that the management of relationship has more challenges, and therefore the interactions have to be far more nuanced and much more carefully calibrated than in simplistic terms of treating each other as adversaries or enemies or friends or frenemies. These terms have been out of discussion for almost a decade to describe relationships in simplistic terms. Because first of all international relations are getting complex, whether it is Nepal, India, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, United States, Nepal, United States, all relations are becoming far more complex because of increased connectivity and therefore increased interdependence. So complex interdependence in international relations theory increasingly explains the kind of challenges that interstate relations have. And therefore we nowadays hear of most nations, choosing to hedge rather than sort of confront, or choosing a multi-vectored relationship rather than simplistic monotonic relationship in that sense. So relations in any case are becoming complex, and that is true also of India-China relations. Now let me bring what is specifically complex about India-China relations. Other than the fact that the whole world is getting into more complex relationships, these two are world's two largest population nation states. So there are too many people and too many opinions and too many activities and actions and things that are happening, which makes it much more complex in terms of how the relationship is to be built. Second thing that also adds on specifically to make this complexity unique is the continuing civilizational tradition of about 5,000 years on both sides, which could be treated as stock of wisdom. You could also treat it as a baggage, but fundamentally, enormous amount of attention needs to be drawn to semantics and symbolisms, which sometimes are missed by Anglo-Saxon traditions of Western experts who try to look at China-India relations from the prism of more recent contemporary international relations theory. And therefore, that complexity is again something I would highlight. And third and most important, unlike most other nations, China and India are the nations that have transformed enormously in last half a century. I also noticed that we have about 68 people now with us. So it will be nice that if we can see each other as I speak, that would make me look like I am speaking in a classroom. And if many of you can appear as we thank you so much, and I see many of you are now switching on your video, it makes a sense that we are more interactive, and I look forward to some comments and questions later with that I will try to address. So fundamentally, 3 or 4 things that makes complexity of India-China relations much more unique and much more complex than the overall complexity of international relations. I want to make a first important contention that given the fact that both China and India have transformed enormously in last 40 years, they are also extremely conscious of not derailing their relationship. They're very careful. So for instance, both countries today spend the second largest and the third largest defense budget on planet Earth. They have the very powerful 2 militaries on both sides. And then they are nuclear weapon states. And imagine as many as 600 times there are incursions or ingressions on the line of actual control. So you can imagine countries that are spending the second and third largest defense budget have 600 ingressions on line of actual control. And what happens? These 2 powerful armies are seen shoving, pushing, throwing stones. I would like to underline admiration that we need to hold these armed forces in. Imagine the restraint that they show. Despite border not being defined, even line of actual control not being clear at about a dozen places, and then managing that kind of difficult equation with just pushing, shoving, and throwing stones. That I think is an example of how they are conscious of not derailing their relationship and derailing their trajectories of growth and development and inordinate historic opportunity to come back. Until Industrial Revolution, China and India were the main centers of production around the world. They want to come back in 21st century to revive that stature and have a global role. So they are conscious of that, and therefore they maintain the relationship very, very carefully. Now, what is complex here is that development has also meant not just increase in salaries of teachers, but also increase in the provisions that they provide for their military and for the infrastructure. So both have agreed we don't want to have a border problem. We will manage it in template called peace and tranquility. But both sides have developed enormous amount of infrastructure, rail, road, hospitals, everything. And therefore, they also have much smarter armed forces. Now, even if they are conscious of not getting into trouble, what happens is both sides are much capable now to bring much larger, bigger size of equipment, larger number of soldiers up to the front in a very quick fashion. In matter of hours, if some of you have seen videos of disengagements that have taken place, especially the initial disengagements of last year in south and north of Pangong Lake, you will notice how Chinese also use that disengagement to demonstrate the capacity of PLA in mobility, how they were moving back these tanks. So the sheer fact of a better infrastructure, more smarter soldiers and equipment on both sides makes the intensity and frequency of face-offs, sometimes violent face-offs on the border more frequent. So that makes the relationship much more complex, even if you have two leaders, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, in their two informal summits, particularly the first one in Wuhan, had agreed to provide a direct strategic direction to armed forces to ensure peace and tranquility on the border. There is complexity simply because of development, because of the more assets at hand. Second important area, which should be seen not the negative, but positive. Border is negative, positive is economic engagement. China is India's largest trading partner. And imagine, despite the border tensions in 2020-21, you all remember Doklam, the trade grew up for the first time in history by 43%, hitting 125 billion US dollars. That's a positive sign. But that positive sign again creates complexities, because once you have an enormous trade with each other, there are trade-related complexities. The most big one that all of you are familiar is continuing for about 15 years, inordinately large-sized trade deficit in favor of China, almost reaching $100 billion. India sought to deal with that by promoting Chinese FDI into India. So if Chinese are producing things in India, they won't be treated as imports, and the trade can be not just balanced, but that product can also make Indian exports more competitive by collaborating with Chinese. So if you look at which are the 4 or 5 cell phones which are most popular in terms of quantity in India, not value, the first 4 of the 5 are Chinese, 5th is Samsung. So that experiment was tried.
Sorry,
India also
Professor,
apparently looks like,
wrap up in 2 to 3 minutes.
sure, 2 to 3 minutes. 2 to 3 minutes. So the effort to partially also work with BRI. Most people think India is boycotting BRI. India is participating in several things that I can go in detail later if there are questions. But fundamentally, the economic relationship also has complexities, and at regional level, that economic relationship has put India into Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, China leading the regional comprehensive economic partnership. Third important complexity, which is new, is India has now about 24,000 Indian students studying in China. And in pandemic, they have come back. Now there are visa issues, they have to go back. So these are practical. When you are in love with each other, you want to send your students. Even friendship creates complexities. And let me quickly deal, there are many issues, but one more point before I close, is enormous asymmetry, which is also new, which wasn't there before. So when China and India understand how to deal with older challenges, there are new challenges that make relationship extremely complex. Asymmetry can be understood in many ways. One quick way to understand would be that China's global trade deficit in China's favor is bigger than India's total exports worldwide. So the size of Chinese exports and thereby engagement around the world is very different. Chinese GDP, which was similar, India was 297 billion, China was 312 billion in 1990. Today, estimates of China's GDP is about 16 to 18 trillion US dollars. India about 3.1 to 3.2 trillion dollars. So that asymmetry gets maximized because China has one party rule, one leader rule now you can call it. And therefore, how to use those economic deep pocket leverages are very different compared to how Indian leadership can use those leverages that it has, which are already limited. So that asymmetry adds on another component to the complexity of relationship, which sees India trying to now, last point to make, follow what is called multi-alignment foreign policy with strategic autonomy, long-term independence of foreign policy, autonomy, strategic but tactical maneuvers. And India is playing right now that very, very difficult path of building partnerships in as many sectors with as many countries as possible, including with China. And that particularly makes India's foreign policy and engagement with China much more complex. And simply the fact that India is already a very diverse society, multiple languages, all world's religions are there, ethnicities, regions. And I think in that sense, the tradition of unity and diversity in India, civilizationally, helps India to deal with increasingly complex relationship with China. Let me stop here. I look forward to some comments and questions.
Thank you, Professor.
And I was delighted that NICE invited me to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Soren Singh. You have covered range of, especially the different political systems and civilizational roots of these two most populated countries, and of course the defense budget of these two countries and the size of the army. I mean, if you talk about the size of the armed forces, then they are in numbers, they are first and second. Again, I see from that perspective, that angle also. And while comparing India-China trade of 2021, I can recall only one point from my side. While I was pursuing a PhD in GNU, it was 2003. While studying course of South Asian economies, it was 3.1 billion, and it was 1.6 in China's favor and 1.5 in India's favor. I mean, so it was like 49.51 or 48.52. And now we have seen that it was 95 and the rest, 97 and the rest, or something like that. And that was in a big hue and cry after Make in India and the supply chain systems of Indian, economy. But we can talk in detail, but there are some questions, they are not pointed towards any panelist, but anyone can take, or specific if they have mentioned. Like one is like Sunil Gautam is asking, how do you think the third term of the Xi Jinping going to impact India-China relations, or the complexity, how it can? Another is Anil Kesi. Anil is asking, has India-China ties faced tensions due to the BJP nationalist parties? And then as India-China has managed, you can read that, but asking from that angle. But the third question, which is focused on the Sri Lankan dimensions, Professor Mendes can take on that. So should I request, first of all, Professor Soren Singh, how the third term and the BJP nationalist strategy towards the China? Two very specific questions, Professor.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Bhatt, I will try to be brief so that we can have more questions and comments. Two things. One, The third term of President Xi Jinping is unprecedented. He's being compared with Chairman Mao. And I think that brings enormous pressure on President Xi Jinping to justify why he should continue to be leader for the third term. It's also possible that he would like to, as many experts believe, go for the fourth term. And if he goes for the fourth term, he'll have to really do something unusual during the third term. And one very simple way of what has been his main focus of rejuvenation of Chinese nation or China dream would involve consolidation of China. And therefore, I think it would have direct impact on Taiwan and therefore with the United States. And also because of a disputed border with India, it will have impact on India. So it would see a greater assertion of China in that sense, which is natural. And that is nothing to do with personality of Xi Jinping, that the whole kind of scenario is such that if he goes for third term, he'll have to do something unusual in that sense. We normally say Mao brought political independence to China and Deng Xiaoping created economic revolution. So Xi Jinping will have to achieve something unusual, and that is something which would underline his third term. As far as nationalism question is concerned, I think that's a global phenomenon. Most nations have seen in last decade the rise of the right, and most conservative parties around the world are kind of being empowered, be it in Europe or in other countries. And therefore that nationalism is kind of very interesting. In most cases, nationalism, when it asserts its identity, it also denies similar identity to other possible subnational groups within that same nation. And therefore, you can see nationalism is almost becoming an ideology. Whether it is United States, you are hearing now a return of, for example, Republican Party leaders. One of the congresswomen was quoted recently saying that we now need a nationalist party, that Republicans should now emphasize more on nationalism. Same as Joe Biden is doing the same thing. China is also adopting nationalism as ideology. So nationalism is going to undergird most foreign policies increasingly. And last point on this, great powers which need to not just bring their internal cohesion, but also justify their external generosity of engaging other countries in very, very generous terms, will have to push that narrative of nationalism much more strongly, much more central to their national policy making, which means both China and India will have a greater dose of nationalism in impacting their bilateral relations.
And Professor Mendes, we have one question pointed towards you. Have you seen that in box, or should I? Jatindra has asked one question. Have you seen that in the chat? Or should I read out that?
Read out, please.
Okay. Jatindra is asking Professor Patrick, how do Colombo did not fulfill the commitment to accountability so far, even though many resolutions have been passed. On the other hand, Tamils continually urge the Sri Lankan issue should be taken into ICC. China has continually supported Colombo and opposed Western pressure for human rights. What is your strategic assessment of US pressures on the HR situation in Sri Lanka? Do you think China's anti-human rights card will increase its robust presence in Sri Lanka? Further, it seems that China has been showing much interest in the Tamil areas. Recently, Chinese ambassador visited the eastern province, including strategic Trincomalee twice. How do you see this Chinese approach? It is purpose to initiate India or China moving with long-term intentions. So can you take on that?
That's an excellent.
We have one question for Dr. Antonio also.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and also very complex answer to that excellent question, because the driving forces right now, just like Soaran explained to you about is a nationalism. It is a global phenomena. If you look at it from the US to Hindutva in India, and even Sri Lankan Buddhist nationalism, and even look at the Myanmar, for example, this is the certain forces are at work. And it is a bottom line is nationalism is the cause, and that's its identity. That is also driven by the economic development, where that the minorities were given the more equal opportunities in education, political and economic sectors and everything. And there are the rising forces that challenge the majority rules. So as long as we have that common saying, majority rules and the respect the minority rights. So which is boiled down to these two forces. One is nationalism, and how do you balance as human rights? So when you created the United Nations, then you can see that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came into being. And if you look at the US constitutions, when the US was created in 1776, and the Bill of the Rights came, the rights to have assembly and the religion and their own way of life and so forth. So you can see this is we recognize this is a nationalism is the problem everywhere, if you look at it. So China recognizes this one when you look at it in the Tibetan issue or the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province. It is a nationalism driving this one. How can we resolve this one is the US created a mechanism, check and balances, and the legal framework that is the right of minority has to be protected. And what we can see is the multi-alliances of these forces are at work. So in China, this one, and also for the US and India, has this becoming real problems of this ideology of nationalism. In China, while they are trying to reconcile that Sri Lanka's Buddhist Sinhalese and Tamil Hindu minorities in the north and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka, and China is pretty much reaching out to these minority communities. So you can see this is a strategic view, because if the India was to have a more influence in the north and the east, especially the Trincomalee, and China needs to get into that the game, strategic game. So therefore, China recognizes while they have their own issues of recognizing minorities in Tibet and the Xinjiang Uyghur population, they also have a different way of looking at the minority issues in Sri Lanka, where that China overall during that 30-year civil war supported the Sri Lankan government, not the Tamil population minorities. So therefore, you can see this is the conflicting situation for China. While they initially supported the Sinhalese majority, Buddhist centered government, nationalist government in Rajapaksa's time, and on continuing in a different formation. That issue itself recognized by China that now need to have, for the strategic point of view, need to reach out to the Tamil and Hindu population, especially in the northern Tamil. So this is also a problem for Modi government in India, because they have their own Hindutva nationalism going on, while they're addressing the human rights and civil rights issue in the northeastern part of the Kashmir region of India. So therefore, there's this fundamental issue reaching back to the founding of the United States. They recognize the Bill of Rights. They need to give the rights to the minority and protect the rights of the minority. And the United Nations was created. Then soon afterward, that the US proposed that one, we need to have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can see this is our plane. We recognize this issue at the very beginning of the founding is the US and the United Nations. And this is going to be the key role that we need to address in the coming years and months to come. Nationalism versus
thank you, Professor Patrick. I will come for the second round. You have two more questions, but before that, I will ask one query and one question for Dr. Antonio. One is, will Indo-China border issues poses a threat to war in the near future? It's Siri Makija. So it is, I mean, indirectly or to some extent pointed to Dr. Antonina. And another is Nabraz Lama asking, you said that after His Holiness demise, the US will not allow China to complicate the succession. Do you think that China and US will confront each other on this issue, like the Taiwan issue? Is US really committed to the rights of the Tibetan people? So these two questions, if you
Thank you very much for those questions. These are very complex issues, but I will try to be as brief as possible. So the first question, as I understand, is it more and more probable that the war will occur between China and India over the next years or coming decades? Well, I would say that we can never rule out a possibility of a war. Nevertheless, especially that the last 5 years have shown that the increasing tensions between China and India, so far we can see that this conflict, this dispute has been under control. So, for example, in 2017, surprisingly or coincidentally, the Doklam crisis was solved just 1 week before the prestigious BRICS summit, where Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi were supposed to meet in China. So we can see that if there is a goodwill, like a central will, and like a top-down strategy, if there is a signal, okay, we have to clear the atmosphere, we have to make it look right, there is disengagement possible, tensions can decrease, and so on and so forth. In case of Galvan Valley, it took 2 years to lead to the disengagement, yet it is happening and it is possible without any of the sides losing face. And I think this is also one of the very, very important elements here. Neither of the sides can make an impression that is taking a step back or losing face, because it is also a matter of international prestige. However, I'm probably a little bit less optimistic than Professor Singh, because I would say that China does not have will to totally solve the China-India border issue. If it had will, it probably could have been solved years ago. Nevertheless, over the coming years, this conflict can be warmed up and then cooled down whenever China needs to. It will be a forever tool or leverage of China over India to cut India's wings down, to put pressure on India, to drain India's military and financial resources, so that India can never think of global ambitions, can never think of going out of the Indian Ocean, and South Asia can never think of the Indo-Pacific ambitions and Indo-Pacific strategy, but it will forever be kept sandwiched by China from the Himalayas in the north and from the south, from the Indian Ocean, for example, when China keeps increasing its influences in Sri Lanka. When it comes to the second question, I think that, well, the US legislation does not really solve the issue either, and the situation will indeed get complicated. And I would say that the most possible scenario is that at some point we will have 2 Dalai Lamas, one appointed by the Chinese and one appointed by India/Tibetans or Tibetan community in India. Nevertheless, I think it is, at least from a legal or human rights point of view, a very significant gesture of the United States. Definitely, it will never ever escalate to the position of the Taiwan conflict, and we cannot expect that kind of engagement. Nevertheless, I'm pretty sure that the US will be ready to take that kind of small yet meaningful decisions. For example, to put sanctions on several Chinese.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony.
Thank you.
There are a few questions which is to be responded by Professor Swan. I mean, Professor, have you gone through the questions, or should I read out that?
I think Sajad is on the screen and he was raising his hand.
And one Alok.
I would give priority to people who are on my screen.
Yeah, there are 3 questions, please. You have 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up and respond these questions.
Good afternoon. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. I have few questions about the border disputes.
Azad, we have to be very brief.
Please,
To the point, yeah.
please give me some answer. I am in a tension. How China and India will decrease their border tension along with Pakistan, because Pakistan is also the part of both countries, and we want how they maintain in a small country like Pakistan, because Pakistan under pressure because of both rivalries. And I would like to ask that, can India free or decrease the tension between India and Pakistan?
Let me be quick. I think the most questions are about India-China relations around the border. And thank you, Sajid, for your question. First thing I want to underline, nobody can solve problems for Pakistan. Pakistan's problems will have to be solved by Pakistan. So if Pakistan wants to improve relations with India, that will be very significant if relationships have to improve on both sides. You would notice that Indian Prime Minister had made uninvited visit long time back in 2015 December. So that was an unusual gesture of an Indian Prime Minister to decide to stop in Lahore and then go for the wedding of grandchild of Nawaz Sharif. So it has to be from both sides in that sense. I am a little more optimistic than Antonina, and I want to explain that why. Because you heard the whole world media recently talking about a statement made by Indian Prime Minister to President Vladimir Putin. He said, this is not the era for war. And that sentiment is also repeatedly underlined by President Xi Jinping. If you read his speeches, the fact that both China and India understand this is an unusual historic opportunity for them to grow and revive their greatness is a great incentive that they will not escalate any of the ingressions or sometimes skirmishes that could happen. But yes, both will continuously have greater pressures, both internal and external. And I agree with Antonina, Chinese, given the asymmetry, would like to show India the place where it is actually standing. And my hope is from that track record. If you look at last 40 years, India and China have managed their enormous transformation and its impact on bilateral relationship fairly well. Only on this Friday, there was a 25th meeting of the working group for consultation and coordination on border affairs between two Ministry of External Affairs. They have decided that the Corps Commanders' 17th meeting will happen again. They are constantly talking to each other. They have not been very successful in disengagement. I agree with Antonina. It has gone on for 2 years now to find a final resolution. And that could also be seen in case of Doklam before that. Doklam also took 10 weeks time. So complexities, no doubt, are increasing. That is why this panel discussion about complexities of China-India relationship. But the track record gives greater hope that both have evolved and learned how to step in with new innovative methods to manage that relationship. And managing the relationship is where the challenge lies. We saw before that Soviet Union and United States. They did not have to go to a hot war before Cold War came to an end. So I'm not saying that necessarily the relationship between China and India is one of the Cold War. It's a very different relationship. They are next to each other. They share world's longest disputed border, etc. But the consciousness of these two power elites on both sides, that they cannot afford to derail the relationship, is what is making them manage. And management is all that is required. I wouldn't say that China and India would ever become buddies or best friends. Even India, United States have problems. United States has Black Lives Matter issue inside. Every country has issues inside and outside. But managing is where I think that the key lies in ensuring that management happens well. And I think the track record of management on both sides is amazing. Nepal now is, shifting the contracts from China to India. This last week only, one of the hydropower project is now being given to an Indian company instead of taken back from Chinese company. These are not unusual things. Things can change again. That contract will go again to Chinese. That's fine. So fundamentally, my last point, India, China have learned to be in comfort with a multi-vectored relationship where you have all kinds of shades of coordination, cooperation, confrontation, contestation, conflict, everything happening simultaneously. Only the managing of these colors is where I think that the key lies. And so far they have done well. And Pakistan is an integral part of China in their relationship. Pakistan's special relationship with China makes Pakistan unusually important for India. Minus China's friendship with Pakistan, Pakistan becomes a very different entity for India in that sense. So when we talk of India-China relationship, Pakistan factor is important. For China, Tibet factor is important. Taiwan factor is important. So I think we have hit the nail by saying we are focusing on the increasing complexities of the relationship. And have we managed it so far? Fine. But past can guide us for future to some extent. But I would not, like Antonina said, ever rule out the possibility. I mean, there could also be possibility of Czech Republic fighting a war with Poland in the coming years, or Russia or Germany fighting a war with Poland. So tensions between nations are is something you never rule out. But are you aware of what are the triggers of tensions? What is likely to be the solution to that tension? And therefore, sorry, Chair, I was just give me 1 minute because I now remember I forgot to deal with the question of Indo-Pacific and Sagar.
Oh, yeah.
Increasingly, nations are moving from continents to oceans because trade is now happening not in value terms like ancient times, it's happening in volume terms. And 95+% of volumes are on oceans. And therefore, whole world is more conscious of oceans. And then, of course, blue economy, because of all resources are now being explored in oceans. Entertainment, leisure, pleasure, holiday, livelihood, food, everything is now being explored on oceans. So oceans are significant. Therefore, March of 2015, Indian Prime Minister had launched Sagar Initiative, Security and Growth for All in the region. And that is later followed by Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative in 2018. So India is trying definitely to be engaged with oceans as much as China is trying to be engaged with oceans. China has now, bases from Djibouti to Solomon Islands, including Gwadar and Hambantota in between. So also India. So these two growing countries will have to expand to oceans and deal with each other. But yes, I think there was a question of whether India's joining with Quad has impacted China-India relations. Yes, India's growing proximity with the United States does impact China's consciousness about India, whether India is bandwagoning United States, but India has not. India has also continued to be BRICS with SCO, with everybody else and with China. And so that balancing is at two levels. One, both China and India have balanced and managed the relationship so far very well. And I'm hopeful therefore for future. Second, India has also over a period of time shifted from non-alignment to multi-alignment. And that's a complex proposition to make. How can you keep every other country happy with us? That's not an easy proposition. That could also generate suspicion that friend of all is friend of none in that sense. I understand that. But look at Middle East. India is a very close friend of Israel, of Saudi Arabia, of UAE, of Iran, countries that don't see eye to eye with each other. They are all friends of India. And therefore, United States, when it has to build another Quad in West Asia, what it does, it picks up UAE and Israel and picks up India. India has nothing to do with Middle East, but Middle East Quad also has India. Indo-Pacific Quad also has India. To me, that's a greater recognition. So if China has enormous deep pockets, India has enormous goodwill with the West. So each side has its own advantages and leverages. And therefore, I think we should not lose sleep in that sense. We should be conscious and keep debating about the complexities of relationship. But that's not a subject I will lose my sleep on. I think that will keep us debating about complexities of India relationship and China relationship, because what they do together will decide the future of the world. Soon they're going to be the third first and third largest economies of the planet. They're already the largest populations. Next largest population, the United States, is 1/4 of the size. And you can see Chinese are leading bulk of the international organizations now. Bulk of multilateral, multinational private corporations are led by Indians. So the number of people itself will be significant. And therefore, I think the world is moving in a very different direction where war, to quote Indian Prime Minister, is not an option. War is not an option. And I think leaders understand that. Thank you.
Thank you for your thank you for responding the questions made by many participants, and one question for Professor Mendes. It's, I think, Shidi is asking about, do you agree that India's neighbors, or like Sri Lanka, Nepal, can contribute to the India-China tension? I think he or she is asking about, like, the making contribution, any kind of contribution.
Say it again, India and what? No, he said India and what? Contribution.
Sri Lanka, Nepal, countries like Sri Lanka and Nepal, or the neighbors of India, can contribute to the India-China tensions. Means to reduce the tensions.
Well, reduce in the sense what happened, you see that Sri Lanka is very strategically important to the China dream, the rejuvenation of the Chinese culture, especially the maritime Silk Road one. And that is very critical. And on the north side, just like Dr. Antonina mentioned, that Nepal is also critical because that is the border in the both countries and Tibet as well. So therefore, that the northern route of the Chinese strategy and the southern route of the strategy, they are trying to put the sandwich between. So I think China is going to continue to have this is a border issue, which started, from in the Mao Zedong time. He recognizes that the right-hand farm of Tibet policy pretty much is continuing throughout these years. That also gives the focus for India to the northern border. And while they are doing all the work in the southern border, which is the Sri Lanka base, because if you wanted to have the, as Professor Singh said, oceans are the most important critical part of it, that one. That's why we have aircraft carriers, all the navies working on it in all the regions of the world, especially in the Indo-Pacific right now, in the focusing on there. So you can see that China also recognized the importance of the Horn of Africa in Djibouti, and also to the Malacca Strait, and also the South China Sea, and trying to propose the Kra Canal between through the peninsula of Thailand. So therefore, this is a strategic bottlenecks of this transshipment of goods, and goods are going through to the survival of the China is critically important. So therefore, I think that India continue to have this tension in order to focus on India's interest in the northern part. It's not going to be a war just like happened in 1960s, but to keep the pressure and the focus on that region. At the same time, other forces, the trade and investment, and is going to have these countries bound. So this again going back to what these countries, China, India, Sri Lanka, or even the US itself, doing the one premise. One premise goes back to the founding of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, the third president, and the first president, George Washington, both said, trade with all, entangle with none. So you can see that Swarang's analysis also fitting into this ancient wisdom. Trade with all, entangle with none. This is going to continue one form of another with all the tension that coming from every country.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. As you have been contributing related to the trade and peace, and how trade can lead to peace. And Professor Swaran has already said that yes, that from non-aligned to the multi-aligned or the multilateral engagement among and the between many countries and the many forums. Yes, we all know that there are many parallel activities are going on, as China has been proposing new and new, like in the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and at the sideline, AIIB is there, India is there, SEO, many. And at the same time, yes, complexity is there, and this is the reality of the 21st century. And we haven't touched upon the cyber or the internet or the AI-related issues or all these kind of areas which have been posing new security challenges and the complexities, not only between the countries, between the nations or the nation states, but among the individuals. And at the same time, yes, as Professor Swaran Singh come with his article, I haven't read the article, but the book you have come up with is the fascinating, that how this China and the Chinese issue in terms of ideological debate is there. So thank you, Pramod. Thank you, panelists, Professor Swaran, Professor Patrick, and Dr. Antonina. And thank you, Pramod, for giving me this opportunity to hosting this August panel, and hope to work in some, coming other programs also, other webinars, other possible in the physical programs also. Thank you, Pramod. Thank you, nice team.
Thank you,
panelists.
Thank you, Chair, Dr. Patrick Mendes, Professor Swaran Singh, Dr. Antonina Lucci US. Thank you so much for your valuable time and interesting discussion. It was really great learning experience. We'd like to thank our chair, Dr. Deepak Paraswata, for chairing this session. We're also very grateful to all our participants, more than 70 who joined even in these late hours and actively participated in the discussion with important questions. We have another interesting session on 19th of October on regional security of South and Southeast Asia by Lieutenant General Daniel Leaf, former commander of US Indo-Pacific Command. So see you on 19th October. Good day and good night.